I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now in our 28th season. I know, I can't believe it. I'm so delighted to be here in this gorgeous room at the Abel, which is a membership-based center built by and for women over 100 years ago. They host great cultural events of their own, and they're great to Writer's Block and to me. They want me to tell you that it is a membership organization, and they welcome new members, and they're here. So, if they took me, applications are easy, I promise. Now for tonight. We've been reading Frank Foer in The Atlantic and have followed his career while he was editor of The New Republic. I loved his book called Jewish Jocks, which won the National Jewish Book Award. His exhaustive reporting on politics and culture for The Atlantic, whether on geriatric electeds, which we haven't heard anything about recently, soccer greats, or Biden's presidency, gives us context and perspective, and I find it decidedly and so refreshingly uncynical. His new book, The Last Politician, doesn't beatify Biden by any means, but it reveals the most tactical and strategic politician, a president who has lived and breathed and loved making deals, but deals that matter. I kept thinking that Biden could have and should have written a book himself called The Art of the Deal. Politician has become a sort of a dirty word, but in Biden's case, Foer shows that Biden, the consummate politician, pushed America forward by leaps and bounds. We seem to have an embarrassment of riches here tonight in the form of presidential observers and journalists. Amy Chozick followed the Hillary Clinton campaign for the New York Times twice, in 2008 and in 2016. Her book, Chasing Hillary, made huge waves when it came out because of the revelatory and sometimes unbearable conclusions she drew about the campaign itself, the brains behind the campaign. Chasing Hillary is also the basis for Amy's series on HBO called The Girls on the Bus. So here's what's going to happen tonight. Frank and Amy will chat about Biden's presidency and whatever else they want to talk about. When they're through, we'll have time for questions. No speeches, please. Just questions. Afterwards, Frank and Amy will sign copies of their books, which are available in the lobby through Chevaliers. Thank you so much, Amy Chozick and Frank Foer.
Oh, do we have? Oh,
yeah. I'll share mine.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here, and this is just a riveting book. And I was telling Frank backstage, I really appreciate how deeply it goes into policy, because I think as political journalists we get very wrapped up in the horse race and things that do not broadly impact people's lives. But this book is riveting, but also gets into all of the policy that I feel like is sometimes lacking, or just we don't hear about as much as we should. And also, Frank broke what is known in publishing as the Biden curse. So even tangential Trump books always seem to make the New York Times bestseller list, but Biden books rarely do, and congratulations for breaking the Biden curse. I found myself reading this against a really fascinating backdrop, right? Thinking about and I love your title, and I love how you put this really, we were saying backstage, Biden is not boring. He's a fascinating political figure, and putting him in this context as the last politician, the sort of last of the Mohicans who believes in bipartisan deal-making, who believes in, he used to go out of the Senate and go, I know Republicans, they're good guys. You could do backslapping, you could make deals with them, this old-fashioned style of politician. And I'm reading this book thinking about Biden's true belief in this kind of old-fashioned style, almost antiquated style of politics, as, of course, impeachment proceedings are happening, as congressional Republicans, the far right of congressional Republicans, are about to shut down the government next week. And I just thought, kind of, how do very current events square with this belief in Biden's kind of steadfast belief in bipartisanship? Has he wavered? Will he waver?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Tomorrow's your birthday.
It is. That is true.
So I'm not sure that Biden fetishizes bipartisan deal-making, and that's the essence of what it means to be a politician. I think it's one element of it and one direction that he believes in taking. But what I came to conclude about Biden, when I first met Joe Biden, I was 24 years old, and I was able to get him on the phone, and it felt like a big deal to me as a young reporter. And 5 minutes into the conversation, I'm like, get this fucking guy off the phone. Stop it with these stories already. And I never had any real respect for Joe Biden, even when he was vice president, because I knew all the ways in which the Obama people would roll their eyes at him, because, for all the reasons that we all know, that he wears his insecurities on his sleeve, he wears his ambition on his sleeve. And there's this element to him that's just messy, and that's his humanness. It's like he is
Uncle Joe.
He's Uncle Joe. Yeah. His humanness, just like it spills all over his lap. And what I guess I came to conclude watching him up close was this quality that he has is actually at the core of how he moves about the world and how he wields power. That he's able to see his ambitions and insecurities in the people that he's dealing with, whether it's Kevin McCarthy or Vladimir Putin, and that's how he analyzes a situation. And he doesn't think in terms of big structures or ideas. He's a guy who is psychological in his outlook. And, yeah.
No, it's so interesting because some of those characteristics, I think, I've covered Biden for years, and that he was a gaffe machine. It was clean up on aisle Biden. It was always like he was running his mouth and like keep Biden in the closet. And now those things are very much framed as he's losing it, it's his age, he's too old. And I'm sorry, you're like a geriatrician at this point. People have been asking about the age. But just because you brought up his style, and Maureen Dowd, who's covered, I think, Obama longer than any journalist, just had a column that was like, this is just Biden. Like, let Biden be Biden, because by muzzling him, protecting him from those personality quirks that we've all seen for decades, it's feeding into this narrative that, like, he's losing it. So
I think he does it to himself, too.
Yeah.
That he knows about this tendency that he has, that if he goes on Meet the Press, he's going to make news, and probably not for the right reason.
He's going to like cause a regime change because he like misspoke. Yeah.
Or make gay marriage happen.
Yeah, yeah.
And that tendency that he has is something that he knows, and it's part of the reason why he doesn't do as many press conferences and interviews as he definitely should.
Yeah.
One of the things that really surprised me about Joe Biden was, so in 1987, the seminal moment in his life, he has this scandal where he's accused and guilty of plagiarizing a speech by the British Labour leader, Neil Kinnock. And this is the seminal moment in his life. And the cliched version of his story, he goes from being, I love these like Washington cliches. He goes from being a show horse to a workhorse. And he's determined that nobody's ever going to see him as being this plastic, superficial guy ever again. And when he prepares now for a public presentation of any sort, he just chews up his afternoon preparing. And it's very different than Obama, that when aides would try to prep Obama for a press conference, he would run in the other direction because he knew that he had it.
Yeah.
Biden isn't sure that he has it. And so he calls in experts because he doesn't want to just be reciting talking points. And then he starts talking to the expert, and he goes down a cul-de-sac where he's like, I need to talk to the person who told you this because I don't really understand it, or I don't believe you, because he asks very specific policy questions. And his aides, who've been around him since 1988, I mean, they've been around him forever, understand how to deliver information to him, that he's a narrative sponge. He's like, I need the detail that will allow me to talk to John Tester about farming in Montana as it relates to this big piece of legislation. And if you haven't come prepared with that, he'll be very pissy with you. And he tends to, one of the unattractive qualities he has is that he tends to punch down at AIDS. That if you're a lower ranking aide and you don't know how to deal with the Biden method, it becomes very uncomfortable for you. And the people around him, like if you're Ron Klain or you're Bruce Reed or these staffers who've been around him forever, they know how they come in with, Bruce Reed comes in with index cards anticipating the questions that Joe Biden will have for him, because you have to prepare in order to prepare Joe Biden.
Yeah, we were talking backstage, part of this gang of advisors who have been around him since '87, literally, are still there. And I think that's interesting. It speaks to they understand his thinking. But also kind of what does it say about Biden that he's kept the gang together for that long? I mean, you look at like Bill Clinton, as soon as he got elected, the Arkansas advisors were, nowhere to be seen. And so what does it say about him as a...
So Joe Biden is an Irish Catholic politician who grew up in the 1960s and therefore reveres the Kennedy family on some level. And for him, Klan is the atomic unit of politics. And so his staff isn't organized as a tribe or as a faction. They're a family. And there are ways in which they're all intertangled. So when Mike Donnellan, who's one of his aides, ran for student council president at Georgetown in 1980, his campaign was covered by Ron Klain, who became his chief of staff. And so they know each other. Bruce Reed is his daughter's godfather is Ron Klain. Like they're all, and so whatever, and Joe Biden is the beneficent father figure that they all have. And to work for Joe Biden means that you sometimes suffer his temper, but you also have these incredible moments of grace that are just so unlike what most politicians give their staff. So the way that he'll treat their kids or call their mothers or do all these things that we kind of know about Joe Biden that sound trite or cliche, but are actually deeply meaningful if you inhabit his universe.
No, it's really interesting if you think of Bill Clinton having this incredible empathy, the gift for retail politics. He wouldn't need to be briefed. He'd walk into we'd go to some kitchen in Las Vegas and he'd go, I remember meeting your mama. And it was an incredible gift. And Obama had obviously incredible oratory. And in your book, it feels like Biden's gift is he's the old hack who could. He's the one, he can just steadily get things done. And I think that's something that we sort of don't appreciate as much as we should from the first administration. Biden's administration has passed some truly sweeping policies, a more progressive, successful agenda than any administration in recent history. Infrastructure week became a joke in the Trump years. So I guess give us the broad, and I know this is like most of your book, but if you could just like the headlines of kind of the really giant achievements that he's had in policymaking that I think are getting lost, whether it's in questions of age or with inflation or polling, but yeah.
So I'm going to meander into this. You were talking about the psychological element of politics and the political way. It's a political approach to politics, which sounds like a strange phrase, but both Obama and Trump, in their ways, were anti-politicians who came into office believing that they were leaders of mass movements who could kind of speak over the heads of Congress and the media. And
wait, I have to tell you, this was like controversial when I read it in your book, and then when I thought about it, I was like, oh, he's right. But like, I just want to stop you to dig into it a little bit more. That this idea of the politician being, people haven't liked politicians for many. I remember reading a book about the Roosevelts and, esteemed New York family. They didn't want to be known for a low business. They didn't want, their lineage getting into politics. But that you draw a line with Obama and Trump in very different ways, but both sort of eroding our like of Washington establishment figures and political figures. So I just want you to get into that a little bit more because I find it true and also sort of jarring.
Well, I just remember, I remember with Obama very clearly when he first ran that he had a whole plan for governing where OFA, Obama for America, I think was the name. And it was this organization that was going to maintain this link with the grassroots organizers, and that he was going to have this movement that was going to help him short circuit the way in which business was done in Washington. I had a really interesting conversation with Jon Favreau, who was Obama's speechwriter, and he said that there was a point in the second term where the Obama speechwriters would include in drafts of every speech these lines about how Washington was terrible and politics were terrible. And Obama, by the middle of his presidency, would cross those lines out. And he would tell them, look, I know that's muscle memory. I know why you put those lines in the speech, because that's what we ran on in 2008. But my views actually changed. And part of it was that he'd come to belatedly respect the likes of Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi, and in fact, Joe Biden, and to understand that their conception of politics was actually the more efficacious version than his own.
Right. Fascinating. And so we saw this, and you saw this up close. You get inside the room, which I do want to ask you. The Biden administration is famously averse to press, but you really got inside the room in some of these giant policy achievements. Walk us through some of the biggest.
Okay, so when Joe Biden started to run for president, he was known as the safe, moderate guy.
Right.
And that was his whole battle with Bernie Sanders was about pragmatism versus revolution. And by the time he came out of the primary, as he'd had this sense that he was leading a coalition and not a faction. And that, I think, led to him starting these working groups with the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren campaigns to come up with an agenda. Meanwhile, his administration was actually at the wonkish level, was populated by a bunch of white guys in their 40s who had started off as proteges of Larry Summers and Steve Ratner and Richard Holbrooke and kind of the eminence grise of the baby boomer generation. And they'd worked in the Obama White House, and they came out pretty shaken by what they hadn't accomplished as it related to solving the ills that were left by the financial crisis. And also, they were really disturbed by the rise of Donald Trump and the ways in which their administrations may have inadvertently contributed to the rise of Donald Trump. And so they start to brood and ideologically wonder, and there's the sociological element too, which they could see that the people who were just younger than them were being attracted to Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, and that was where the zeitgeist was heading. And so you have people like Brian Deese, who's the most important figure in constructing Biden's economic policy. He was the head of the National Economic Council.
It's so funny because I've known him since he was like a kid working for Hillary, and it's like to hear him at this central.
I know, and he's still, by Biden's standards, he's still a kid.
So me and Biden about the same age.
And so they end up just shifting their economics. And Joe Biden is a very unlikely vessel for some sort of progressive economics. But Joe Biden is an incredible nostalgist. That for somebody who suffered so much in the past, he's constantly yearning for the past. There's this Eden that's out there. It's Scranton. It's the reason he talks about Scranton so much. And it's Wilmington, Delaware in 1955, where DuPont was a beneficent corporation that treated its workers well, that actually made things, that was rooted in a community. And that's really what he wants to return to. And so there was this convergence where Jake Sullivan, who's the national security advisor, who ended up putting together, who I'm sure you've covered since he was a kid too, put together the economic vision for the Biden campaign in March 2020, and he'd written an essay called the New Old Democrats. And the point was that really what we're talking about with the new progressivism is a return to some version of New Deal liberalism, which is not exactly what the Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders people want, but it's a version of that. And Jake Sullivan was probably one of these guys who would roll his eyes at Biden when he worked for him before, but kind of could see the ways in which Joe Biden was circling back to something that he was actually attracted to on a deep ideological level. There's another thing that's really fascinating about Joe Biden's economics, which is that his best friend is this guy named Ted Kaufman. And Ted Kaufman was, in fact, an engineer who worked for DuPont in the 1960s. And he kind of fell in love with Joe Biden when Joe Biden first ran for Senate. And he asked to work on Joe Biden's staff, and he became his chief of staff. And they would ride to work every morning, or most mornings, from Wilmington, Delaware, because Joe Biden had made a promise to Hunter and Beau Biden that he would never fall out of touch with them. And so in the late 70s and early 80s, that meant they had to drive in this big car where they could keep this enormous cell phone in the trunk. And they would have all these conversations. And then eventually Ted Kaufman gets appointed senator from Delaware. Total inside job that Biden engineers for his best friend. And Ted Kaufman gets appointed senator in 2008 during the financial crisis. And he looks at what happens to the banks. And he can't believe that nobody's paying a price for what happened. And he becomes incredibly radicalized by this experience. Simultaneously, Beau Biden is Attorney General of Delaware. And he and Kamala Harris actually bond because they both hate the deal that the Obama Justice Department has crafted with the banks to deal with the housing crisis. And so the two people closest to Joe Biden, his best friend and the son he reveres, are radicalized and are headed in this Elizabeth Warren direction. And they start talking to Biden about it. And so Biden, who'd been the senator from MBNA, the credit card company, is suddenly starting to understand some of the problems with American finance. And I think that he begins to head in that direction. And I think that he feels, anything that is an unaccomplished Beau Biden legacy is something that bothers him on some visceral level. I mean, not that he's done very much about finance, but one of the interesting things was Ted Kaufman was also in charge of appointing personnel for the Biden administration. And he would basically say there was a joke, anybody who'd had an internship with Goldman Sachs in the 1980s was not going to get a job in the Biden administration. And as Elizabeth Warren always says, personnel is policy. And so there are all these Elizabeth Warren people who began to populate the ranks of the Biden administration. I think Janet Yellen was relatively probably one of the more progressive people that they could make Treasury Secretary. So I haven't answered your question at all about the achievement, but I gave you the backstory.
It's very interesting because I actually reading it, I think watching Biden get so attacked from the left of his own party in the primary, and I think having been out of politics for years, I found him sort of ideologically hard to pin down reading your book because I associate him with these Clinton-era centrist. I think he said he regrets Glass-Steagall, but I associate him with the crime bill that, of course, has been blamed for mass incarceration. I associate him with, his tough questioning of Anita Hill during the Clarence Thomas. I associate him with these things that he has actually either evolved from because he's truly changed his mind or because the political tides have turned, or maybe a combination of both. But I thought it was really interesting because I think I kind of missed when Biden switched,
Yeah. It's true. And I didn't really expect it, except that I could see the policy ambitions that they outlined during the campaign. Which is, if I could segue, it's that's probably one of the reasons why I was able ultimately to get access to them, was that the idea for writing this book was not my own, it was my publisher's, and she called me soon after the convention and said, do a book about the first 100 days of the Biden administration. Yeah. And I was like, I don't know, and she worked me over a little bit about it, and she said, okay, this is about people rushing in to deal with the pandemic, an economy that's on the brink, and with trying to repair the broken instruments of government. And that was helpful to me in having her frame it that way. Not that I knew a book about the first 100 days is like a trope and that unlikely to have enough material to actually fill out a book, but I could get excited about the idea of, especially after Trump. It was like I felt so like just stained and demoralized about having covered Trump for so long. The idea of well-meaning, earnest people going into the government, the image I had initially was like Ron Klain, the chief of staff, with a headlamp on, going in and surveying the ruins of the Trump administration.
Basically.
And figuring it.
Yeah.
And so that got me excited. And then, and so I'd known.
And then you bought Ron Klain a bunch of lunches. And
yeah, exactly. So no, but before I did a book, I called the handful of people I knew in Biden's inner circle, and I said, if I did a book, is it plausible that you would talk to me? And I'm not asking for a commitment, but I just want to know, do you think that this is a good idea? And so I got enough commitments, and then I started. And then, as you know, it's like the beginning of an administration is a terrible time to write a book, because everybody is afraid of leaking, and everybody is enmeshed in crises. They don't know what the story is during that. And so it's hard for them to, and I got to the 100-day mark, and I was a little bit panicked. I was like, I don't have enough material for a book, and my relationships with these people it's just very superficial. It's like I'm just getting pablum from them. And then it's not a very complicated trick, but people like to talk about things after they've happened. Yeah. And so if you just can manage to get over the discomfort of like not knowing what's going to happen and not being totally sure that you're going to get the material at the end of the day, but you just need to wait for the withdrawal of Afghanistan to be over. I mean, that for me, that was I started calling people about Afghanistan in September and October, when the withdrawal had happened in August. Yeah. And everybody wanted to talk about it, which really surprised me, but it was the most traumatic moment of their career. And everybody wanted to explain why they'd done their best in the situation, or to cast blame in a different direction. But that's when the good stories start to come rushing out.
Right. No, that makes total sense. And I think that's one of the most riveting parts of the book. It really reads like a movie. And I think that I want to talk more about Afghanistan, because I feel like his determination to get out speaks also to like a larger Biden personality, right? The stubbornness, once he makes up his mind, that's it. Yeah. So kind of walk us through those early. Which
is also a tendency of old people, right? To be suddenly, it's like one of these things. It's like, is his stubborn determination like a sign of characterological strength, or the early onset of dementia? But I would argue it was a strength. I mean, so what happened but not in an unqualified sort of way.
Yeah.
So Joe Biden, I mean, you started to talk a little bit earlier about kind of his chippiness, that he's this guy who's from the inside, yet who never feels like he's been totally welcomed into the club.
Yeah, I mean, I was just saying backstage, like, it's fascinating that you can be 80 years old and president of the free world, and you still have a chip on your shoulder that you didn't go to an Ivy League school. It's like it never goes away, and I think that seems like something that's still driving him when people say don't run again, that he shouldn't run again. It's like he loves being the underdog, he loves to show those elites, and so this was, I mean, you think even, I didn't actually associate it with Afghanistan, but
but as it relates to Afghanistan, the foreign policy elite, what LA resident Ben Rhodes, who worked for Obama, termed the blob, like his relationship to the blob is very conflicted. Like, on the one hand, he loves to go to Davos and Council on Foreign Relations meetings, or to the Munich Security Conference, where the foreign policy, the good and great of the foreign policy world like to convene. And he wants to be accepted there, but he also knows that because of the way that he talks, and he's never going to be truly accepted there. They're always going to look at him as the guy who went to the state school.
Or he feels they always are.
No, but it's true that, I mean, I don't know about what happens in Munich or in Davos, but like certainly in...
But surely he's not like meeting world leaders and they're like, this guy went to a state school and used to have a stutter. Like...
No, but when you talk to people in media,
yeah,
right, to take one small segment of the elite that we know well, people don't really think that highly of Joe Biden because, like, you know, it's just the stories get told over and over again. That you assume that there's something.
There's like a schlockiness.
He's a cheese ball guy.
Yeah.
He's like muscle car Joe, whatever the cliches are, and I think that's real.
Yeah.
And he knows that it's real.
Yeah.
And so, with something like foreign policy, he wants the Council on Foreign Relations to love him, but he knows that they won't, and therefore he sets out to show that he's smarter than the lazy thinkers at the Council on Foreign Relations. And he actually was doing the work as it related to Afghanistan, so he would go to Afghanistan starting in the first months of the war, and he was sleeping in sleeping bags on conference room floors, and he was waiting in line with the Marines with a towel around his waist to shower in the morning, and then he would encounter Afghan warlords who had the temerity to ask the United States to do more for Afghanistan, and that really pissed Joe Biden off. And every time he would go into a meeting with Hamid Karzai or a warlord and they would complain about what the United States was doing, he'd start projecting Beau Biden onto the scenario and say, like, you're asking us to sacrifice more? Show some gratitude. And in his Scranton code, ingratitude is really a terrible, terrible sin.
Though I found it very, I have to say, a little jarring when one of those quotes was, we're not going to sacrifice American soldiers for women and girls. And that I definitely kind of paused when I'm reading that.
Yeah.
But
well, but that's what's so troubling, and so he was liberated from conventional wisdom as related to Afghanistan because of his feelings about gratitude and the like. And so he was able to see earlier than most people that it was a fruitless war and that there was no doubling down on it. But he's like, his sympathy and compassion for the Afghan people evaporated. And so as he begins to think about how to get out of Afghanistan, his primary motive is trying to prevent what happened to Barack Obama, because Obama probably wanted to get out of Afghanistan too, but he felt like the military kept putting him in a position where they were offering him choices that meant that he was doomed to stay. The military was leaking stuff from conversations that meant that Obama felt like if he committed to withdrawing, he'd look weak, and so he persisted. And there was a moment where Biden went up to Obama in the Situation Room and said, I see what they're doing to you. They're trying to jam you. You're a young president. Don't let them jam you. And so as he began to plan for the withdrawal of Afghanistan, everything was about not getting jammed by the military. And so he constructed a process that was kind of meticulous in that regard. But there was he left the people of Afghanistan out of his moral calculus altogether. It was like, how do I prevent the next Beau Biden from going to serve in Afghanistan? That was the be all and end all. But it was left to the generals to ask questions about humanitarianism, and nobody really asked those questions hard enough.
Yeah, so of course one of my favorite parts of the book, and I am biased, but Hillary's involvement in trying to get prominent Afghan women out of the country. It was called the Kill List, a list of prominent women who were surely going to be killed by the Taliban, and her efforts to get them out. And I thought it was very interesting that the administration started calling this list Hillary's List, which to me diminished the the stakes. But there was this part of the book is really riveting, a real page turner of how she and her network of NGOs sort of quietly, and I think you're the first person to ever report this because they didn't want to take the thunder away from and that Biden-Hillary relationship is a whole other talk. But obviously she didn't want to steal his thunder in that period, but a network of NGOs working to get these women out. And please tell us about the white scarves, and please, you got to tell the potato chip.
Okay.
Because that was one of my favorite details.
Thank you. In the narrative of Hillary Clinton's life, the women of Afghanistan actually play a very significant part, because coming out of the Hillary Care debacle, she was unsure about her place in the world, and she started to recover and find her mission by talking about women's rights in an international context. And one of the first flashpoints for that was that the Taliban had just taken over power in Afghanistan, and the State Department wanted to recognize the Taliban, and there were because there were a lot of pressure from oil companies to do that. And the women who visited Hillary made the case about what the Taliban were going to do to women, or were doing to women, and she intervened in a very, very forceful sort of way. And so she actually succeeded in helping prevent Bill Clinton from recognizing the Taliban. And then she becomes Secretary of State, and she gives awards to various Afghan women. And it's not an incidental part of her career. She would ask questions about these women, and in fact, she subsidized, this is something else nobody's talked about, or never reported before, she subsidized quietly fellowships at various NGOs for Afghan women. She's funded documentaries about Afghan women. And so when Biden makes his decision to pull out, she takes it personally, and she starts to hear from various people about the lack of planning. And as it happens, Jake Sullivan, her protege, is now the national security advisor. And so she starts to call and really
annoy them.
Well, annoy them, but pressure them. And she did it in a way that was fairly bureaucratically savvy. I mean, it's not, when Hillary Clinton calls Jake Sullivan,
But Jake is in a difficult position.
Yeah. But I mean, he presided over the process to withdraw from Afghanistan. I think he is proud of that process. But so Hillary could see that the administration was not going to do anything on the humanitarian front. And so she then, through this network of NGOs that she has, starts to create a network of safe houses on the ground in Kabul, and they start to contract with security companies to be able to take women out of the country. And so when the crisis happens, she had plans, or her NGOs had plans for what to do. Not terribly perfect plans, because nobody had ever dealt with a situation like this before. But over the course of the last couple weeks of August and after, she was able to get 1,000 women out of the country, which entailed her conducting shadow diplomacy. She had to get transport planes. So she ended up calling the Zelensky government in Ukraine, which pissed Jake Sullivan off, because and she had this retort. He's like, "Why are you calling the Ukrainians?" And she said, "Well, I wouldn't have to call them if you would." And then she had to get visas for these women in some place where they could be temporarily housed and then ultimately housed. So she called Justin Trudeau in Canada and got a couple thousand visas for these women to be permanently relocated in Canada. And then because of what Bill Clinton did in the Balkans, she was able to call the Albanians. And
they love me in Albania.
Exactly. The president of Albania talks about all the children who are named Bill Clinton in his country. And so they're able to get 1,000 women into Albania. But in order to do that, they needed visas. And so these NGOs were working with the Albanians to make visas on the fly that would be credible to very literal-minded Taliban soldiers on the ground. And there was this bag of potato chips that they saw. And so one woman from a Hillary Clinton NGO said, you know what, let's just take a picture of the QR code on the back of this bag of potato chips and slap it onto the visa because that will surely persuade the Taliban to let them through.
It's fascinating. The Taliban does not read barcodes, so that's. And they were wearing whites. They were known as the white scarves in order to filter this network and recognize them at airports and checkpoints. It's really fascinating TikTok of how this shadow diplomacy happened. I have a political question since we're on Hillary, and it's something I've always wondered: is how does Biden feel like he should have run in 2016? Does he resent Obama for paving the way for Hillary and discouraging him from running? Does he think he would have beat Trump in 2016?
I think he probably thinks he would have beaten Trump in 2016, but he was just not emotionally up to it at that stage. I mean, Beau Biden had just passed away, and he was a shattered guy. And when we talk about Joe Biden's age, really the key moment is Beau's death, and that he just emerges on the other side of that as a guy who's a shadow of his former self. He just doesn't talk in meetings in quite the same way that he did before. And I mean, who knows what the single cause is, but in the Obama White House, people would say after Beau's death, he just stopped coming in and trying to dominate meetings with his monologues, and that he would recede more easily in a meeting.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I also feel like the tragedy in Biden's life has forged his identity as this believer in the political system, right? I think, we've all read Richard Ben Kramer's great tome, What It Takes, on Biden and the '88 campaign, but the Senate became a surrogate family. I find that so interesting, that it's not just that Biden believes in this system in order to pass through policy, but he has such a deep emotional connection for the Senate in this profound way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Richard Ben Kramer's book, because ultimately, as I began to think about this book, I mean, I, of course, went pretty quickly to the Richard Ben Kramer book, which I'd read when it came out, and it's just such a spectacular book. But what was so odd about going back and reading Richard Ben Kramer was the way in which Biden had become so familiar that people started to neglect all the ways in which he was the star of that book because of his insecurities, because he just burst off the page. And so people get older. Obviously he's aged, but you don't really change that fundamentally so that you become, boring.
Right. No, I know. Whenever people say Biden's boring, you want to refer them back to that book. I mean, it's just a fascinating arc, losing his wife and his child, and then finding the comfort of politics in the Senate, becoming his surrogate family. Yeah. It's just one of the most fascinating political biographies.
But you're right. What you're pointing at is interesting because he's an institutionalist, not because he has this abstract faith in institutions, but because this one specific institution stepped in and rescued him at the moment that he was lowest. That when he lost his wife and his daughter, he lost his faith in religion. He lost his faith in a beneficent God. He would stroll the streets of Wilmington aching to punch somebody. And then he had good old
Mitch McConnell.
He had good old Fritz Holling and Hubert Humphrey who rescued him and invited him to dinner and made him feel like he was worth something and renewed his sense of purpose. And at some level, that's Joe Biden, right? It's that he's somebody who thinks about the world.
It's not academic, it's not intellectual. It's like a visceral, emotional connection that I think is really fascinating. Yeah. Almost more so. Okay, you mentioned Zelensky. He was just at the White House today, and that is also a fascinating dynamic in the book. Yeah,
I remember.
They did not. Let's just say they didn't hit it off.
In the first week of the war, I called a friend in the administration who does national security, and I was like, "All right, I assume that there's this like mentor-protege relationship here with Biden and Zelensky," and he's like, "Nah, that's not the way it works." And it took me a while to kind of figure this out. That when Zelensky first showed up at the White House in 2001, Zelensky had just survived all of the travails about the Trump impeachment, where he was a central star, and I think and Hunter Biden was a central star, and so I think this is me projecting a little bit, but I think that Zelensky somehow blamed Joe Biden, like just didn't have good feelings towards Joe Biden because of Hunter Biden. I think that Joe Biden had been involved in Ukrainian politics far longer than Volodymyr Zelensky. He had the Ukraine portfolio in the Obama administration, had been going back and forth to Kyiv. And Zelensky was a comedian who had just become president. And if Joe Biden's respect is ultimately directed at his fellow politicians, like he couldn't recognize a fellow politician in Zelensky. And in the first meeting in the White House, Zelensky comes in and, in the words of one national security official, crapped the bed. Like he started to talk to Biden about NATO membership, and Biden's like, okay, we could talk about NATO membership, but that's not going to happen because the French and the Germans don't want it. And then Zelensky started to pivot about how even the French and Germans didn't want NATO to exist. And Biden, it was just not.
That was quite the pivot. He's like, you know what, NATO.
Yeah.
Who needs it? I mean, the way you write it so vividly, and you really put us in the room, and it's like obviously the stakes are massive in geopolitics. But I just kept thinking, it's like the old cop that's about to retire, and it's like the rookie comes in, and it's just the complete clash of personalities from the very beginning.
But the stakes were much lower at that point because we didn't know that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, although they had threatened to invade Ukraine earlier in that year. It's something people don't think about, but in April, about 3 months into the Biden administration, Russia amassed a lot of troops on the border with Ukraine, and they were conducting military exercises, and we didn't understand what was happening. And Angela Merkel was still on the scene, and she had this relationship with Putin where they had a fascinating relationship where, I don't know if you remember when Putin, she's afraid of dogs, and Putin brought these 2 big dogs to one of their meetings in order to freak her out. But Angela Merkel spoke Russian, and Putin had this fear-respect thing with her, and he backed down in April, and we weren't sure if it was a feint or if we were reading that correctly. But in October 2021, a couple months after the debacle in Kabul, we got kind of crystalline evidence about what Russia was intending to do in Ukraine. And in Afghanistan, our intelligence failed, but Russia was our Cold War adversary. We have Russia wired. Our intelligence on Russia has been pretty impeccable throughout this whole war. The Russians are a little bit sloppy. And so we got the Russian war plans, and we had to show them to Zelensky in it's like almost 4 or 5 months before the invasion actually happened. And Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, meets with Zelensky on the fringe of a summit in Rome, and he's like, they meet with him, and they're like, hey, your country's about to get invaded in all directions by the Russian army, biggest land war since World War II. And of course Zelensky didn't believe it, because who would want to believe that that type of thing is about to happen to you? And so over the course of many months, American officials kept talking to Zelensky and to his government saying, hey, this is happening. What are you going to do about it? And one of those meetings that was very poignant, Kamala Harris, about a week before the invasion happened, met with him at the Munich Security Conference. And the United States did not want Zelensky to go to the Munich Security Conference because we were very afraid that if he was out of the country, then it would have been easier to install puppet government there. And he decided to come, and they met at this bank across the street from the conference. And Kamala Harris, who was very happy to have this assignment because Munich Security Conference is Joe Biden's happy place, and it felt like a big deal for her to go, and especially to talk to Zelensky. And so she meets with him, and she's like, I'm telling you this is happening. And he says, I don't believe it. I think it's just coercive diplomacy. And he thought maybe they were going to do a small-scale invasion, maybe there would be a cyber attack. And she was really pressing him on this issue of continuity of power. What happens if the Russians take you out? Essentially, she was saying. She didn't say it in that many words, but that was our fear. What if they assassinate you? And you need to have a plan. And as it happens, we had been working on our own plans for a continuity of government, for there to be some sort of Ukrainian government in exile at some point. We never got very advanced in those plans, but we were sketching them out ourselves because we were that worried about it. And Zelensky said, what should I do? And Kamala Harris says, take it seriously. Don't be in denial. And at the end of the meeting, Harris puts her hand on her chest and bids him farewell. And there was a sense that they might not see Zelensky ever again.
And he was at the White House today. So.
And here he is at the White House today.
He is at the White House today.
And his relationship with Joe Biden, I think, is on sounder ground because he can see what the alternative is.
Right.
But it's still very complicated.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned Kamala, and we haven't talked about that, but like, talk about rabbit ears and her role in the administration. And I also feel like it's very interesting in the context of Joe Biden having also felt like an underutilized vice president under Obama. So does he have some empathy for her frustrations?
Yeah. Right. So, vice presidency, premise for a comic show on HBO.
Truly.
Every vice president we can think of has been in some situation that's relatively akin to the one that Kamala Harris is in, where you feel like you don't know what your purpose in life is. But the hardest thing, I think, harder than being a vice president, is being a former vice president's vice president. And Joe Biden brings a lot of baggage to the conversation. And Barack Obama would use this phrase, my vice president, that really rankled Joe Biden. It made him feel like he was, his pet dog or something. And so he was very determined to accord Kamala Harris the formal respect that he believed he never received from Barack Obama. And so he's very meticulous about asking her office to be looped into everything. But the beginning of the administration, they're stuck together in a way that I think is very unusual because of COVID. And so instead of carving up a division of labor, she's trailing him to every single meeting. And it's interesting, aides very early on would reflect to me that they were the same person. And it's like, when I look at Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I don't see the same person. But their point was that that they each bring different insecurities to the job. Joe Biden brings this insecurity of not wanting to look like a plagiarist, not wanting to look dumb. She brings the insecurity to the job that she's a historic first, and she's convinced that if she makes a mistake, it's going to be that whatever mistake she makes will get her destroyed in the press, and then will shut the door for everybody else who follows her. And both of those insecurities can become paralyzing in their ways. And so they both prepare massively for everything. And that's something that they share. But I think in both cases, it makes them maybe less eloquent or articulate in public than they are where Kamala Harris in a meeting is really smart. Everybody says this. Like I ask people in the military, what's Kamala like in a meeting about Afghanistan? And they say, she asks incredibly good questions. She's a former prosecutor. She doesn't let things go. And then when you watch her do an interview in media, it seems like she's so afraid of making a mistake that her sentences sometimes start to lose meaning, and they wander off in directions that I think just don't.
Selena Meyer.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a Jill Biden conspiracy that I'm going to run.
All right, launch it.
Jill Biden, okay, Biden's approval rating, very low, comparable to Trump, if not lower. Kamala's approval rating, even lower than that. The person who seems not polarizing at all is the lovely Dr. Jill Biden, and she hardly factors at all into this book, and I'm just wondering if you think the administration is sort of consciously not talking about any of her opinions or advice on any of these issues because she might become the the polarizing first lady, and we don't like
Edith
those.
Wilson
or the Hillary, and and I just think that for an older president to have this younger, very intelligent wife, there's no way that she doesn't have opinions on a lot of this legislation. There's no way that she's not talking to him about the Dobbs decision or any number of things in your book, and I just wonder did you ever get any, inside the Biden marriage, her role as chief advisor?
Yeah. It's strange because it's something that everybody acknowledges, and then they're loath to introduce any specific pieces of evidence. And some of that is that I think they do keep things in private, and that that they talk about everything. But she's very, aside from the issue of education, where she's an activist, her credit card is the National Education Association credit card, MasterCard, and she was very involved in picking the Secretary of Education, and she doesn't leave much of a footprint in other areas, and also she's a good proxy for him. She's because nobody, as you say, nobody dislikes Jill Biden. But I don't. So in there, you get
it's impossible. Ever
you
since
get the
New York
stories.
Times put on the front page about how great a marriage John and Elizabeth Edwards had, I was like, no more writing about marriages. We don't know what goes on behind the closed doors.
Yeah.
So it's probably impossible to know. But I did wonder. I just think she must be. You know, they must be discussing all of this. She must
I get. So I can tell you. Here's the things that I can tell you. So I think within the White House, if Joe Biden sometimes will have flashes of his, what he calls his Irish temper and rankles. She's somebody who's a conciliator, and she'll go cut flowers for somebody and deliver them to them in order to make them feel good. In the mornings, she'll frequently tape messages to Joe Biden on their bathroom mirror. They're like little passages of poetry or exhortations to him.
Poll numbers.
Yeah, poll numbers. Yeah. I mean, I know. As I'm saying this, I know
it's together, honey.
This is like too cutesy. It can't possibly be the real story.
That's That's my conspiracy. I feel like we've been pretty substantive. So now I do want to ask about some of the 2024 speculation. You know, this widely read column in the Washington Post that Biden's had a very successful presidency, but his biggest achievement was defeating Trump, and now it's time to let someone else do that. And I can see it from, I can actually see it from Biden's perspective, given that he's the only one who has defeated Trump. He also, I just remember, constant predictions of a red wave in the midterms. He staved off the MAGA wave in the midterms, and so I'm sure he's thinking, I've defeated him twice, why can't I do it again? And that you see the poll numbers, and I'm of course skeptical of polls, having covered the 2016 campaign, but this is at national averages, Trump slightly ahead, and I guess, you've got inflation, now you've got this ongoing immigration crisis. There are factors that are outside of his control, but of course age is a big one. 77% of Americans say that he'll be too old to be president. 69% of Democrats, 82 in his second administration. Only 4 years older than Trump, by the way. But this is a narrative that's clearly impacting voters. I see David Plouffe saying, Obama's advisor saying, this is a bunch of bedwetting by Democrats. I'm like, he literally told me the same exact thing in 2016 when people got worried about Hillary's weaknesses. Like, the bedwetters are sometimes right. So what are they thinking? What is the, how do they address that? I mean, the inflation issue in particular.
Let me just talk about the age thing for a minute, and then the rest. So. My book came out in the middle of this whirlwind over aging, just as these columns came out, and the probably good for my book in certain ways, but also not really what my book is about. Because my book is about my book is a chronicle of the last 2 years, and so I could tell you, and the way that I address it in the book is that Joe Biden starts his day later, that Joe Biden will forget the names of certain senators occasionally. He will get lost in stories. Like, is that evidence of Joe Biden being Joe Biden or evidence of age?
But he's definitely
I'm sure.
not Sleepy Joe in your book.
He's
I mean,
not- no, he's not.
whether it's the vaccine rollout or like, I really responded to how they reacted to the baby formula shortage. Every little issue that even though we don't know it's happening, they were on top of, they were working zealously on.
Yeah, that he throws himself into the weeds of governing, and that's both a strength and a weakness, in that you kind of want your president to do that. And on the other hand, sometimes your president needs to be able to pause and explain their accomplishments in a way that crafts a message, and he's not very good at doing that.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you reminded me what Ron Klain tweeted at the administration. Cable news ratings were plummeting, people were canceling their subscriptions because Trump was just driving the news cycle, and you had a president that wasn't like flushing classified documents down a toilet or telling us to drink bleach, and suddenly news, and he said, you're welcome, right? Basically like a return to a boring administration that doesn't drive the news cycle, but in retrospect, they probably should have been driving the news cycle more, talking about their accomplishments.
Right. So just with the age, and then I'll go back to your question.
Message.
So the other thing with the age thing is that, all right, so if you were to ask me his mental acuity in the present, and there's something about the mental acuity question that really bothers me, because we're suddenly talking about a continuum with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And so the fact that Joe Biden's sentences trail off, or that Joe Biden may not do events at 8 a.m. It's not the same as his opponent being a lunatic, right? It's like we can draw certain distinctions.
Is the false equivalency that exists.
There's a false equivalency that's being drawn. Yeah. So I think that Nikki Haley has talked about a mental acuity test. I think Joe Biden, as Joe Biden exists right now, would ace that mental acuity test. But that doesn't mean that he'll be this way when he's 86. But I can't tell you how he's going to age, because everybody ages differently, and it's usually not a linear process, and it's usually not something where you hit a sell-by date where a human being is suddenly not good at doing everything, right? And so who knows what he'll be like over the course of the next couple years. I think politically the age thing comes into play in that he can't stump for things. He's more cautious. I think he's more cautious. I think his aides are more cautious about him doing press conferences and interviews, and that's a problem. And obviously it's a problem when 70% of the country thinks he's too old for the job. Right, but inflation.
But I mean, age is something unique to Biden, but inflation is...
But it's also, Donald Trump is no spring chicken.
Right. But the biggest factor with these two men tied in the polls, do you think it's the age question? Do you think it's inflation? Do you think it's a combination of the three? This latest asylum immigration issue is going to definitely come back to haunt him.
I guess all of the above. I don't know. I think inflation...
By the way, Manchin changing that name to Inflation Reduction Act was, that wasn't a good move.
Yeah, it doesn't sing. It doesn't capture the grandeur of a bill that'll do significant things to slash carbon emissions. Yeah. But just as it relates to the economy, because this is one of the biggest frustrations, is that when they talk about Bidenomics, there's the banal way in which we mean Bidenomics, which is that unemployment is at a record low, that inflation has fallen faster in the United States than it has in Europe. Then there's the more robust version of it, which answers the question that you asked me a long time ago that I didn't address, which is what is his accomplishment? And it's the way in which I think he's directed the economy in a way that is very different from how Barack Obama and Bill Clinton directed the economy, which is that the United States government is now playing this decisive role in shaping the trajectory of the economy, that we've made these big bets about the industries of the future, and we're trying to claim the commanding heights, and we're doing it on national security grounds, and we're doing it because it will reduce carbon emissions, but the state now has a significantly different footprint in the market than it did at the beginning of his administration. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, and also, so we have this UAW strike.
Right.
I hear you have a strike here in town.
Yeah.
And I think that it's actually not a coincidence that it's probably happening at a moment when you have a president who strongly identifies with labor while not really taking to date a significant role in either of these work stoppages.
UAW worker, it's fascinating because Biden has always touted himself as a union guy, working class Scranton, and yet, UAW workers do not feel like he is on their side, despite Trump's, union busting rhetoric, and I think also his
not just rhetoric. Trump destroyed
policies,
the national
policies, rhetoric, but is Biden's climate change agenda coinciding with the UAW strike? It's a sort of a fascinating moment.
It's a totally fair question to ask of Bidenomics. Like, is the investment we're making in clean energy just a way to create crappier jobs in the South that will come at the expense of good jobs in the Rust Belt? That's a very fair question. And if those jobs, if the significant investment that the U.S. government is making in the economy doesn't yield something better for the workers who are actually producing these things, then it's a fail. Right. On some level.
But isn't this, UAW is a microcosm for the Democrats having lost the white working class block of voters for many years. Biden hasn't been attracting those voters, certainly in recent elections.
I think it's actually kind of a multiracial problem in a lot of these places.
Yeah.
Interesting.
No, it's fascinating because he's also losing support among voters of color.
Yeah. I think he's
as the Democrats become the party of college educated. We're going to take some questions for sure.
Sorry. Let's take some questions.
Yes. Sure.
I'm going to go around with the microphone for anybody who has brief questions. We have time for a few.
An intimate discussion about politics, what could go wrong?
Right. Todd.
Thank you, Andrea. Thanks. It's great to have you here, Frank, and thank you, Amy. Amy's right. It's a wonderful book. I finished it at 10:30 Sunday night, and if you haven't gotten it already, when you get home to Newark Street, you'll find a note in your mailbox. But it's a book of incredibly deep reporting, very lightly and gracefully displayed. So without burning any of your sources, I wonder, the reporter in me wonders if you could just get a little granular about how you did it. Did you take them to lunch? Did they share documents? Did you meet them in parking garages? Did they get sick of you? Did you get sick of them? How did that source-reporter relationship work?
Well, I'm so happy that you're here. Todd, in addition to being one of the great members of our profession, was my colleague at The Atlantic, where he was an incredibly generous and wonderful colleague. Who's now asking me to betray all my sources and methods in public. So really, it was, I think, by keeping everything ultimately about I tried to keep policy at the center of it, and my goal was to display good faith about asking questions about policy that really showed that I was in the weeds of it, that I was trying to kind of carefully understand the intricacies, and that my account would honor the process, it would take accomplishments and shortcomings seriously. I think that was useful. I think, just to be kind of blunt about it, like, I live in the swamp. I've always lived in the swamp. And you get to know people on the fringes of soccer fields and in nursery school carpool lines, and it doesn't seem like these things are going to be an asset for you in the short term. But then 20 years later, somebody is in power and they recognize you, so that's a valuable asset as well. And I think that I wrote stuff during the campaign about policy where I tried to read the agenda in a way that where I displayed, I thought they were sincere about going big on various things when maybe other people didn't think that they were going to be sincere about going big on certain things. So those articles bought me credibility, I think, with them that proved to be useful, where they could see that if they were going to put a policy out there, that I wasn't going to, I was at least going to take them at the faith that that was their intention.
Hey, Frank.
Hey, Sasha. It's basically, it's like this room is populated with some of the the smartest political journalists I know, so nothing intimidating about that.
You guys talked about the sort of months-long effort to convince Zelensky that the threat of invasion was real. At the same time, from a large part of that period, the administration seemed to be incredibly willing to go public with the intelligence, something I was shocked by in real time. What were their calculations in doing that, and what did they think the trade-offs were, and do they think it was ultimately worthwhile?
Yeah, super interesting. So they created various mechanisms. Early on, this is actually something that Biden talked about in one of the first meetings about the Russian war plans, where he said, if this is really their intentions, let's make this public. And the goal was, if they could expose it, then maybe there was some chance that they could embarrass them or create pressure that would cause them to reverse course. But I think part of it goes back to the 2016 campaign, where you have these Democrats who felt like Russia had constantly caught them with their pants down or outfoxed them in information warfare. And so there was, especially for Jake Sullivan, I think this goal that they could, who worked for Hillary in 2016 and felt that they had they'd lost the information game, that this time they were going to be more nimble and they were going to beat Putin at his own game. And so they created a process within the intelligence community so that if there was a way that they could leak a Russian war plan or a false flag operation, then they would do it as quickly as they can without burning sources and methods. And especially in the run-up to the war, there was a sense that Russia was going to engineer some sort of pretext for invading. So some of the stuff was just comical. It was like in the tradition of the Potemkin village, where they would film corpses and they were going to pin it on the Ukrainians and then use that as their justification for invading. So every time we were able to expose that in advance, it would delay the invasion. And they think that it actually succeeded in disrupting their timeline for whatever that's worth at the beginning of the war.
Oh, sorry, Frank, great to see you.
Hey.
I can't wait to read the book. Do you respect Joe Biden and think that he has had a successful presidency, first part, and then second part, if he were primaried, and obviously there's a lot of variables there, would you vote for him?
So, yes. I mean, I think the arc of my story in the book is really my belatedly arriving at respect for Joe Biden as a politician and for the craft that he displays. And also, if you look at the basic layout of American politics right now, where on January 5th of 2021, he didn't have a majority he woke up that morning without having a majority in the Senate, and then you in this unlikely way win a Democratic majority in the Senate that afternoon, that evening, on the eve of the January 6th insurrection, that for him to be able to pull off as much legislation as he has in that context, I think is pretty much the most that anybody could plausibly have achieved. And also, this is something that we haven't talked about, but I think is incredibly important, which is that when he arrived in office, the pandemic was raging, in addition to being on the precipice of economic collapse and also possibly civil war. But the pandemic really shaped everything in the nation, and the Trump administration had made these investments in vaccines, but they hadn't made the big investment in Pfizer's vaccine, which was the first one to prove out in clinical tests and was clearly going to be the workhorse of the pandemic. And Biden didn't inherit any plan for ramping up production of the vaccine or for getting shots in arms. And within 6 months of coming in office, it was possible to stroll into a Walgreens or CVS without an appointment and to get a shot that would save your life. And I can't think of a better designed program or a better example of government working as it should. And the world is never going to give him any credit for that. And it speaks to the inherent problem and maybe the disconnect of the Biden presidency, that he may be good at politics in the way that I described it and defined it in the book, which is very narrow and very centered on getting things done. But there's this other part of politics, which is communication and messaging and persuasion. But our country has just so little trust, so little faith in institutions, has all this anger and this rage at institutions. So the inside game that Biden's played so well is just so deeply out of sync with the national mood. But on the other hand, I can't help but think to myself, if one of the best government programs of all time that saved, probably, I think Yale did a study, the vaccination program saved at least 1 million lives. Can you think of any other president who saved 1 million lives? I mean, obviously it's not just Joe Biden, it's a collective thing, but any president who's presided over a program that saved 1 million lives in such a short period of time and getting no credit for it, I mean, on some level, we're just broken as a society.
I think we have time we have time for one last question, and thank you. After this question, Frank and Amy will sign books in the foyer. Thank you.
Thanks very much. You sort of touched a little bit on what I was going to ask. You both pointed out that this administration has had some incredible accomplishments, whether it's the pandemic or some of the legislative accomplishments. Why? I think it's almost as though it's deliberate that they are so bad at communicating this. I mean, if we lose, I don't know how many are we, but I blame it on them and their communication. Do they not get it? It seems so apparent and obvious.
So I'm going to quibble with one of your assumptions, which is there's this Dartmouth political scientist has a phrase called Green Lanternism, which is kind of gets at a tendency we all have. I have this myself, which is to overestimate the importance of political messaging, especially given just the nature of American politics. Like on some level, even if he messaged everything perfectly, would it fundamentally change that many votes? I don't know the answer. I think political scientists would be somewhat skeptical of my saying that it would. On the other hand, I think that you're objectively right that they've done a not terribly good job of messaging. And I remember going back to when the American Rescue Plan was passed, a very significant piece of legislation, one of the that cut childhood poverty in half for a period of time. I mean, this is one of the things that I find most galling about the last couple of years is that we managed to cut childhood poverty in half, and we let that accomplishment go, or rather Joe Manchin, more specifically, let that accomplishment go. So galling. So I would attribute it to a couple things. I mean, one, this is where I think the age thing is real, and I think it does get in the way of his ability to persuade people that there's something about the way that he walks and the way that he talks that nobody identifies with an energetic presidency. Where I was going with the American Rescue Plan. I remember Joe Biden's critique of Barack Obama was that good politics makes for good policy makes for good politics. Joe Biden is the son of a car salesman. He understood that in order to make an accomplishment stick, you needed to sell it. And so they had this whole plan for going out and selling the rescue plan, hitting the road. And then there was a hate crime that had happened in Atlanta, and they decided they were going to scrap what they were doing in order to focus on addressing the hate crime. And they never got back to selling the rescue plan. And there's also something about governing in a time of perpetual crisis that gets in the way. I think Afghanistan can't be understated as a hinge moment in the presidency where whatever competence they displayed in the vaccine rollout and dealing with the initial problems of Trump just dissipated, and he was never able to reclaim that reputation that he had going into that month. On the other hand, they did so much better in the midterm elections than all of the iron laws of American politics suggested that they should, and they did that by actually effectively sticking to a message. And the way that Joe Biden frames everything, there's this story that he tells all the time about how his father says, "Don't judge me, next to the Almighty, judge me by the alternative." And they were right about that in the midterms when everybody was barking at them to focus on crime and inflation, et cetera. And they made it a referendum on the other guy.
Are we in a post-policy political climate, though? I mean, I remember interviewing voters at Trump rallies who I just want to get the government out of my Medicare. It was like so detached from actual policy, and that it's become this personality-driven. I just remember, Hillary ardently campaigning to expand rural broadband. There was a very excruciating policies that would have really impacted people's lives, and it was like, more
than disconnection from policy.
What's the matter with Kansas? It's voting against your economic interest or your, the policy. Sorry, what were you saying?
I was just going to say, it's the disconnection with truth, which is I think a bigger problem with that set.
Yeah.
I want to thank you. I'm going to steal this for a second. I want to thank you all for coming, and their books are for sale in the lobby. I urge you to read them. Thank you so much. Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Amy. So wonderful.